Now that we've seen the various ways that gross domestic product is calculated, so what? The most important use of GDP is as a measure of the size of the economy, providing us a scale against which to compare the economic performance of other years or other countries. We also use it to measure our own progress. However, we must be careful, especially when making comparisons over time. That's because part of the increase in the value of GDP over time represents increases in the prices of goods and services rather than an increase in output. To take this into account, we need a modified version of GDP adjusted for price changes, known as real GDP. We will look at all of this throughout this module, interpreting real gross domestic product. In this module, you will learn the difference between real GDP and nominal GDP, and why real GDP is the appropriate measure of real economic activity. When we hear a report of the latest gross domestic product, we are hearing the value of current production at the current prices. Valuing 2009 production with 2009 prices creates nominal GDP in 2009. This is also known as current dollar GDP or money GDP. This is used to gauge the size of the macroeconomy because it does value the total output of final goods and services over that period of time. This measure is often compared across nations. If the GDP in the US is twice the size of the GDP in another country, we often say that our economy is twice as big. However, sometimes this can be misleading. GDP is really a price times quantity measurement. You take the quantity of output and multiply by the price of the output. The idea is that we are looking for the effects of quantity increases. However, if prices rise and quantity stays the same, GDP will increase. This is misleading because the true size of the economy hasn't increased. It has just gotten more expensive. To adjust for changing prices, we create real GDP, which calculates the value of current production, but using prices from a fixed point in time. This fixed point in time is called the base year. Valuing 2009 production at 2008 prices creates real GDP in 2009 and allows us to compare it back to 2008, the base year. This is also known as constant dollar GDP, or aggregate output. Suppose the economy consists of only two commodities. This table shows prices and output levels for 2 recent years in our economy which produces corn and soybeans. Nominal GDP in each year multiplies current prices by current levels of output. In this simple economy, if we look at the column labeled nominal GDP, where we used each year's own prices, it looks like GDP has risen by $6,100. If we find the percentage of increase by taking year 2 minus year 1 divided by year 1, we see that GDP has increased 43.6%. Wow, these politicians are going to really be proud of themselves. But is this a real increase? Did we fundamentally increase output, or did we just experience higher prices? Let's hold prices constant at the 2000 level and compute the value of real GDP. Notice that the real GDP in our base year does not change. It's the same as it was in the nominal year. However, in 2008, we see that economic output has now risen by only $1,000, or 7.1%. While this is still a great rate of growth, it's not the impressive 43.6% we saw before. Let's look at another example. Here, we have an economy that produces apples and oranges. The outputs and prices of the two fruits are shown in the table. Although, from year 1 to year 2, the quantities of both apples and oranges increased, the prices of both apples and oranges also rose. So part of the increase in the dollar value of GDP simply reflects higher prices, not higher production output. To estimate the true increase in aggregate output produced, we have to ask the following question. How much would GDP have gone up if prices had not changed? To answer this, we have to find the value of output in year 2 expressed in year 1 prices. Notice when we do this, instead of having a $500 increase in production, we only have a $150 increase in production. Here we can see a real-life version of our apples and oranges example. The second column shows nominal GDP in 2001, 2005, and 2009. The third column shows real GDP for each year in 2005 dollars, that is, using the value of the dollar in the year 2005. For 2005, the nominal GDP and the real GDP, again, are the same. But real GDP in 2001, expressed in 2005 dollars, was higher than nominal GDP in 2001, reflecting the fact that prices were in general higher in 2005 than in 2001. Real GDP in 2009, expressed in the 2005 dollars, however, was less than nominal GDP in 2009 because prices have again gone up. GDP is a measure of a country's aggregate output. Other things equal, a country with a larger population is going to have a higher GDP simply because there are more people working. So if we want to compare GDP across countries, but want to eliminate the effect of differences in population size, we use the measurement of GDP per capita. GDP divided by the size of the population. This gives us the equivalent to the average GDP per person, and it kind of shows us how much wealth there is to go around in an economy. Another thing that GDP doesn't measure is happiness. Taking time off from work to coach your child's soccer team actually detracts from GDP. Many forms of leisure do not contribute to GDP. Read a book, take a walk, play catch with your child, and you are hurting the economy. Work around the house. If you rake your own leaves rather than hire a company to do it, you detract from the GDP. If you decide to drop out of the labor force to help raise kids, you detract from GDP. But, obviously, these are not bad things to do. Some things that contribute to GDP don't make us happier either. Spending money to put bars in your windows because your neighborhood is unsafe will add to GDP, but it doesn't make us happy to have to do that. Likewise, imagine two economies. One is based on buying and producing assault rifles, where another is based on buying and producing of ice cream. Both will add to GDP, but which one would you rather live in? I know, I'm going to go for the Ben & Jerry's. Sometimes things do improve our standard of living and do actually add to GDP. Cleaning up after a natural disaster or a snowstorm is going to add to GDP. Spending money to fight preventable diseases is going to add to GDP. Those are going to both add to the productive capacities of our country, and they're going to allow for that growth. So, GDP and happiness obviously don't always have to butt heads with each other, but we just have to remember that GDP doesn't measure everything. Let's look at one final example of the importance of using real GDP versus nominal GDP. The South American nation of Venezuela has a distinction that may surprise you. In recent years, it has had one of the world's fastest growing nominal GDPs. So is Venezuela experiencing an economic miracle? No, it's just suffering from unusually high inflation. The figure shows Venezuela's nominal and real GDP from 1997 to 2007, with real GDP measured in 1997 prices. Real GDP did grow over the period, but at an annual rate of only 2.9%, which isn't bad. In fact, it's about the same as the U.S. growth rate over the same period of time. However, it's far short of China's 9% growth rate in real GDP. So again, make sure you know what numbers you're looking at, or make sure you know what numbers the media is quoting, and make sure you do your own investigation. Look at the Bureau of Economic Analysis website when you hear these numbers, and find out for yourself, are these numbers telling you what you think they're telling you?